The mysterious death of a pharaoh. In 1157 BC, the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses V died suddenly when what his scribes called simply an acute illness. He was only 30 and had ruled Egypt for just 4 years. Mystery surrounds Ramses' death and burial. Pharaohs were usually interred after 70 days of carefully prescribed mummification procedures, but Ramses' mummy wasn't buried for almost 2 years. What could have caused the delay? 20th century scientists who have examined the pharaoh's well-preserved mummy believe they may have found the answer. Inspection revealed a rash of raised pustules, large pimples, on Ramses' lower face, neck, and shoulders, as well as his arms. Such pustules are a typical symptom of smallpox. Unfortunately, the pharaoh's physicians left no written description of his illness, but if he did in fact die of smallpox, it would explain why it took so long for him to be embalmed and buried. Corpses of smallpox victims, and even their clothing or bedding, can transmit the disease. So the pharaoh's embalmers might have put off mummifying him until they could be certain his remains were no longer contagious. Or perhaps the first team of embalmers contracted smallpox themselves, and fear of the disease, or a shortage of embalmers, caused a delay in the mummification. There is little hard evidence about the origins of smallpox. It probably first became a common disease among humans in ancient Egypt sometime before 1500 BC. From there it eventually spread throughout the world, causing the death of millions. The English historian Thomas Babington Macaulay called it the most terrible of the ministers of death. Smallpox was caused by a virus, but that wasn't discovered until the 19th century. Most of the disease's victims acquired the virus as a result of face-to-face contact with an infected person. The sufferer gave off millions of tiny virus particles when he or she sneezed or coughed, and the victim inhaled them. During the first week after infection, there were no obvious signs of illness. Then, sometime between the 9th and 12th days, the first symptoms appeared: high fever, chills, backache, and headache. The victim's temperature might jump to as high as 106 degrees. At the end of this stage, 4 days or so later, the temperature dropped, and the patient began to feel a little better. But any relief was only temporary, for the patient soon broke out in the smallpox rash. It usually started on the face, and then spread to the chest, the arms, the back, and finally the legs. Over the next several days, the flat spots of rash gradually turned into raised, blister-like pustules like those found on the mummy of Ramses V. Some patients looked as if they had been badly burned. Even those who weren't as seriously affected said their skin felt as if it were on fire. The pustules gave the disease the name by which it was first known in the West, Variola. This came from the Latin word varius, meaning spotted, or from another Latin word, varus, meaning pimple. Variola wasn't called smallpox until the early 16th century, when another disease, syphilis, spread throughout Europe and the British Isles. Since syphilis in its early stages produced a similar rash, English-speaking people labeled it the Great Pox to distinguish it from variola, which they began to call the smallpox. After about 9 days, the smallpox pustules split open and started to dry up. They formed scabs that eventually fell off, often leaving the victim with deep pitted scars on the face and body. The scars would remain there for the rest of the person's life, that is, if he or she was lucky enough to survive the disease. In addition to the skin, the virus often attacked the eyes, throat, lungs, heart, and liver. A victim might lose the sight in one or both eyes, or might die from the virus's assault in the internal organs. The majority of deaths occurred late in the second week of the disease, after the pustules had developed, but some victims died even before the rash appeared. Smallpox in the Far East. After smallpox became established as an endemic disease in ancient Egypt, it apparently traveled eastward along the trade routes to Persia and India. One of the oldest Indian medical books, written about AD 400, describes the outbreak of a disease that sounds remarkably like smallpox. The pustules are red, yellow, and white, and they are accompanied with burning pain. The skin seems studded with grains of rice. In an attempt to ward off the disease's ravages, the Indians created a smallpox goddess, whom they worshipped for centuries. The goddess's name was Sitala, which means the cool one. The name suggested that she had the power to relieve the high fever and hot flashes that accompanied the disease. Indian art portrayed Sitala as a woman dressed in red, the color of fire, and riding an ass. In one hand she carried a broom to sweep the disease along, and in the other a pot of cool water to soothe its feverish victims. Indians believed that Sitala had an evil as well as kindly side. According to the stories they told about her, she was ill-tempered and filled with a desire for revenge against humanity. She attacked children with smallpox more often than adults because in doing so, she struck a blow at the future of the community. Temples dedicated to the smallpox goddess could be found all over India. In them, worshippers prayed, "O kind Sitala, keep away from us." An annual festival was held on the goddess's feast day. Cooking and other activities requiring heat were avoided on that day, and Indians consumed only cold food and drink for fear of annoying Sitala. Smallpox was probably introduced into China by the Huns, a fierce race of nomads who invaded the northern part of the country about AD 250. As a consequence, the Chinese called the disease Hunpox. The new disease spread quickly, and in response, the Chinese, like the Indians, invented a smallpox goddess. By worshipping her, the Chinese hoped to lessen the impact of the disease and save lives. They referred to smallpox pustules as beautiful flowers so as not to offend the goddess. The Chinese believed their smallpox goddess took particular delight in scarring the faces of attractive children. This was most likely to happen, they thought, on the last night of the year. So on that night, Chinese children wore ugly paper masks to bed, hoping to trick the goddess into ignoring them. As added insurance, many children hung empty gourds near their beds on the year's last night. If the goddess entered their rooms, they prayed she would drop her smallpox rash into the gourds instead of depositing it on their skins. When a Chinese family was struck by smallpox, they set up a drawing or painting of the goddess in their home and made offerings to it. If the patient recovered, this temporary shrine was carried from the home in a specially made paper chair or boat and reverently burned. But if the sick person died, the shrine was torn apart and the spirit of the goddess was driven away from the house with curses. The red treatment. There weren't many reports in Europe of a disease resembling smallpox during the first centuries of the Christian era. Then, in AD 580 and 581, a deadly illness that sounds much like smallpox swept across northern Italy and southern France. A French bishop, Gregory of Tours, left an account of this epidemic. In it, he described the corpse of a dead nobleman so covered with pustules that it appeared black and burnt, as if it had been laid on a coal fire. However, the bishop could have been describing a severe case of measles, a disease with which smallpox was often confused in ancient times. The two diseases weren't clearly distinguished until early in the 10th century. That was when the well-known Muslim physician Rhazes published the results of his observations at the hospital in Baghdad. Rhazes' complete and accurate description of smallpox symptoms formed the basis of all medical texts dealing with the disease for the next 700 years. But Rhazes, along with other physicians of the time, had no idea what caused the disease or how to treat it. If the patient's eyes were affected, Rhazes advised that a lotion be applied that contained, among other things, the dung of sparrows, starlings, and mice. However, he also urged the physician to look carefully and frequently into the eye, and if it be painful and red, then omit this treatment for some days. Since smallpox patients suffered from high temperatures and burning sensations, Rhazes prescribed bleeding to cool the blood. He also recommended what he called sweat therapy to help rid the patient's system of excess humors. Like the physicians who treated victims of the Black Death, Rhazes had studied and accepted Galen's theory of humors. Rhazes also believed that red objects were helpful in treating smallpox patients. It's hard to know where this notion originated. Perhaps it came from the fact that the color red has always been associated with fire, and later Muslim physicians took it a step further. In the 11th century, Avicenna advised that a smallpox patient be wrapped in a woolen cloth of red color so that the sight of the red cloth may move the blood to the patient's exterior and hold it there in a moderate heat. Many European doctors read the works of Rhazes and Avicenna and adopted the recommendations of the so-called red treatment. When England's young Prince John, a son of Edward II, fell ill with smallpox in 1314, his doctors not only covered him with red blankets and hung red curtains around his bed, but also made him suck the juice of a red pomegranate and gargle with red mulberry wine. The prince survived, although probably not because of the red treatment. Hundreds of other people in England died, however, in the smallpox epidemics that swept across the British Isles and Western Europe during the 1300s. Historians think the Crusades were responsible for these epidemics. Between the 11th and 14th centuries, thousands of European Christians journeyed eastward to the Holy Land, where smallpox had long been endemic. There, the Christians waged the series of wars known as the Crusades in an attempt to recover the Holy Land from the Muslims. When the Crusaders returned home to Europe, they may well have brought lethal new strains of the smallpox virus with them. A scourge of children. Unlike the bubonic plague, which spread by a third party, namely a flea from a plague-ridden rat, smallpox was almost always transmitted directly from one person to another, and this could probably happen only when the person was actively sick or immediately after death, as possibly was the case with Ramses V. Moreover, if an infected person survived the disease, he or she would be immune from another attack, usually for life. A person who was immune could not transmit the disease either. Once smallpox entered a community and never entirely left it. After a major epidemic, however, there was usually a lull during which only a few scattered cases were reported. Why? Because those who had survived the previous epidemic were immune to the disease, and the number of people who had never been exposed to it was still small. Eventually, as more and more children were born, a reservoir of susceptible people would build up again. Then one or two cases would spread quickly through the community, and a new smallpox epidemic would occur. Paris, France, was struck by such an epidemic in 1438. Before it ran its course, 50,000 people reportedly died, the majority of them children under the age of 12. The death toll could be even more devastating if smallpox hit a people who had never experienced the disease before. That's what happened when European explorers like Christopher Columbus began to voyage to the New World at the end of the 15th century. For along with their ships, cargoes of food, weapons, and other supplies, a few of the Europeans carried with them the deadly smallpox virus. Smallpox conquers the New World. When Christopher Columbus landed on the Caribbean islands, the Spaniards called Hispaniola, he was welcomed by representatives of the Taino people. More than 1 million Tainos could be found on Hispaniola in 1492. They lived in large, permanent villages, fished the clear waters of the Caribbean, and harvested abundant crops of beans, maize, and squash. This pleasant way of life was soon to change for the worse. By 1518, just 20 years after Columbus's arrival in the New World, more than a third of the Tainos were dead. Many had perished while working in the gold mining camps the Spanish had set up. Others starved because of the disruption of their traditional agriculture, but the majority fell victim to epidemic diseases that they had never been exposed to before and against which they had no defenses. The greatest killer of all was smallpox. From Hispaniola, the smallpox virus traveled to the neighboring islands of Puerto Rico and Cuba, killing large parts of the native populations on both. Now it was only a matter of time before it struck the mainland somewhere in the Americas. In 1519, the Spanish soldier and explorer Hernando Cortez sailed from Cuba to Mexico with a band of 550 men. Mexico was home to the powerful Aztec Empire, which was rumored to be extremely wealthy. Lured by the tales of gold and other riches, the Spaniards reached the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, in early November. The Aztecs had achieved a high degree of skill in architecture and engineering. Their capital, now the site of Mexico City, was built on a series of islands in the middle of a large lake. As Cortez and his men advanced toward the city on a broad causeway, they looked ahead in wonder. "We were all struck with the amazement by the towers and temples," wrote one of Cortez's lieutenants. "Some of us kept asking ourselves whether what we saw was not a dream." The Aztecs and their emperor, Montezuma, thought the Spaniards were descendants of the Aztec god Quetzalcoatl, and received them with respect. Cortez, seeing a unique opportunity, put Montezuma under house arrest and demanded a treasure in gold. The Aztec nobles complied with the Spanish demand, and Cortez attempted to rule the empire through the captive Montezuma. Up to this point, smallpox and other epidemic diseases had played no part in the Spanish assault on the Aztec Empire. Then, in the spring of 1520, another band of Spanish soldiers, this one led by Panfilo de Narvaez, landed on the eastern coast of Mexico. In one of Narvaez's ships, according to a priest who wrote an account of the expedition, there was a black African stricken with smallpox, a disease which had never been seen here before. The African was probably a slave. Starting around 1510, the Spanish had begun to transport slaves from Africa to the New World. The Africans replaced the dying Tainos as laborers in the gold mines and sugarcane plantations the Spanish had established on Hispaniola and other Caribbean islands. They also served on occasion in Spanish military expeditions, like the one under the leadership of Panfilo de Narvaez. When Cortez heard that another Spanish force had landed on the coast, he assembled part of his army, left Tenochtitlan, and moved to put down his rival. Cortez succeeded in doing so, but during the struggle, the infected African must have given smallpox to a vulnerable soldier in Cortez's army. While Cortez was away, the Aztecs rose up in revolt against the Spaniards he had left behind in Tenochtitlan. Cortez raced back to the capital to rescue his colleagues, but the Aztec army still outnumbered the combined Spanish force by more than 100 to 1. Under cover of night, Cortez and his men were forced to flee Tenochtitlan over a bridge composed of abandoned baggage and the bodies of dead soldiers. It seemed like a total defeat for the Spaniards, but without knowing it, they had left a secret weapon behind. One of the dead Spanish soldiers had smallpox. When the Aztecs examined his body in a search for valuables, they accidentally inhaled the deadly smallpox virus that remained on the soldier's corpse and clothing. Within a few weeks, the disease spread throughout Tenochtitlan, killing at least a fourth of the capital's population. It claimed huge numbers of the Aztec army and the emperor himself. Then the epidemic widened out to the surrounding countryside. A Spanish priest described its terrible effects there. As the Indians of Mexico did not know the remedy of the disease, they died in heaps, like bedbugs. In many places it happened that everyone in a house died, and as it was impossible to bury the great number of dead, they pulled down the houses over them so that their homes became their tombs. In the meantime, Cortez regrouped his forces and prepared to attack Tenochtitlan again. He returned in August 1521 and easily defeated the weakened Aztec army. After the battle, the Spanish found so many dead lying about the city, victims of smallpox, not the fighting, that they claimed they could not walk through the streets without stepping on bodies. The mighty Aztec Empire had been brought low by the disease, and it would never rise again. The fate of the Incas. Neither the Spaniards nor smallpox halted their march with the conquest of Mexico. In fact, the disease often traveled faster than the Spanish soldiers. From Mexico, it spread down through Central America and in less than 10 years reached the vast empire of the Incas. At its peak, the Incan Empire extended for more than 2,000 miles down the western coast of South America. Its capital was Cusco, located high in the Andes Mountains in what is today Peru. From Cusco, an elaborate system of roads connected the various parts of the empire and enabled the Incan emperor, who was known as the Son of the Sun, to maintain control over his sprawling domain. When a smallpox epidemic struck Cusco in 1527, the emperor was on a trip to the city of Quito in the northern part of the empire. Runners from the capital informed him that the disease had already killed his brother, his sister, his uncle, and many other relatives. The emperor hurried back to Cusco, but fell ill himself on the way. Taken to one of his palaces, he realized he was dying. He summoned his followers and said, "My father, the sun, is calling me. I shall go now to rest at his side." The emperor then ordered his followers to seal him with stones inside the palace and leave him to die unattended. After 8 days, the followers went in, removed his dead body, embalmed it, dressed it in his finest armor, and carried it on their shoulders to Cusco for burial. Crowds of people lined the roads to pay their last respects to the emperor as his remains passed by. Historians estimate that 100,000 people died in Quito alone during the smallpox epidemic that killed the Incan emperor. Among them were some of the nation's highest military and political leaders, including the emperor's chosen successor. Civil war broke out between the ruler's 2 surviving sons. After a long, bloody conflict, the son named Atahualpa finally emerged victorious in 1532. His triumph was short-lived, however, for at almost the same time the Spanish, under Francisco Pizarro, invaded the empire. Pizarro, like Cortez in Mexico, commanded an army of fewer than 600 soldiers and missionaries, but the Spanish had the advantage of guns, artillery, and horses, none of which were known to the Incas. An ancestor of the modern horse did once roam the plains of the Americas, but it had become extinct thousands of years before the arrival of the Spanish. Through trickery, Pizarro captured the new emperor Atahualpa and had him put to death. Then Pizarro and his small band of Spaniards assumed control of the mighty Incan empire. At once they began to exploit its riches, especially the large deposits of gold, silver, and other precious metals. The Incas might have regrouped their forces and driven out the invaders, but before they could do so, they were hit by another smallpox epidemic, this one probably brought by the Spanish. As a missionary close to Pizarro commented, the Indians die so easily that the bare look and smell of a Spaniard causes them to give up the ghost. Another witness to the epidemic left a description of its effects and sounds remarkably like accounts of the Black Death. The Incas died by the scores and hundreds. Villages were depopulated. Corpses were scattered over the fields or piled up in houses or huts. The fields were uncultivated, the herds were untended, and the workshops and mines were without laborers. The price of food rose to such an extent that many persons found it beyond their reach. They escaped the foul disease, only to be wasted by famine. Some sympathetic Spaniards urged their king to take steps to help the Incas before they all died out, but there was little the king in faraway Spain could do, even if he wanted to. By the end of the 16th century, disease and warfare had reduced the native population of the Incan empire to less than a quarter of its former size. Smallpox also accompanied the Portuguese when they began to establish colonies in Brazil in the 1500s. Jesuit missionaries made the situation worse by herding the native Indians into settlements where they would be baptized and live as Christians. The crowded conditions in the settlements only helped to spread smallpox among the defenseless Indians. Like European doctors at the time, the missionaries practiced bleeding as a treatment for smallpox. In their attempts to fend off the disease, they also staged long religious processions in which all the marchers prayed together loudly. However, the processions probably made person-to-person transmission that much easier. By the middle of the 17th century, more than 100,000 Indians were huddled around 10 Jesuit missions in Brazil. A smallpox epidemic in 1660 carried off an estimated 44,000 Indians, and another in 1669 killed 20,000 more. As their converts died, the Jesuits responded by rounding up fresh recruits from the remote interior of the country. John Hemming, an Englishman who wrote about the conquest of the Brazilian Indians, commented, "Some of the Jesuits may have believed that it was better for Indians to be baptized, but dead than heathen, but alive and free." On to North America. Before 1600, smallpox was unknown among the 20 million or so Native Americans who lived in what are today the United States and Canada. But these Americans would soon suffer the same fate that befell the Indians of Latin America. Beginning in the early 1600s, Great Britain, France, and Holland established permanent settlements in North America, and with the Europeans came smallpox and other contagious diseases that the Native Americans had never encountered before. In 1633, a smallpox epidemic struck the Native Americans living near the Plymouth colony in Massachusetts. Increase Mather, one of Boston's leading Puritan clergymen and an early president of Harvard College, thought the epidemic indicated that God was on the colonists' side. Mather wrote, "The Indians began to be quarrelsome concerning the bounds of the land they had sold to the English, but God ended the controversy by sending the smallpox amongst the Indians at Saugus, who were before that time exceedingly numerous. Whole towns of them were swept away, and some of them not so much as one soul escaping the destruction." The virus soon traveled inland. When it reached the Huron tribe north of Lake Ontario in 1636, terror was universal, according to the account of a French missionary. The contagion increased as autumn advanced, and when winter came, its ravages were appalling. The season of Huron festivity was turned to a season of mourning. The Iroquois, who lived in upper New York State and Canada, were also hit hard by smallpox. The governor of Canada described an outbreak among them in 1679. "The smallpox desolates them to such a degree that they think no longer of meeting nor of wars, but only of bewailing the dead, of whom there is already an immense number." Although they weren't affected as severely as the native population, the North American colonists suffered from smallpox too. Unlike the situation in Europe, where the disease was always present to a greater or lesser degree in the larger cities, it died out between epidemics in the smaller cities of the American colonies. This only made its impact more shocking when a new epidemic struck. Boston alone had to withstand 6 major smallpox epidemics between 1636 and 1698. Rather than risk infection, those who could left the city at the start of an epidemic, just as city dwellers threatened by the bubonic plague had done 3 centuries earlier in Europe. The worst epidemic yet hit Boston in the late spring of 1721. It was brought to the city by 2 infected sailors on a ship from the West Indies. Health officials quarantined the sailors in a house near the docks, but the disease spread anyway. As Cotton Mather wrote in his diary, "The grievous calamity of smallpox has now entered the town." Mather, the son of Increase Mather, was pastor of Boston's North Church. A graduate of Harvard, he had thought of becoming a doctor before entering the ministry, and had long been interested in science. His scientific articles on American plants, birds, and snakes had circulated in England and won him a membership in the exclusive Royal Society. Now faced with a new smallpox epidemic in Boston, Mather remembered a letter he had read some years before in the Journal of the Royal Society. The letter described a method of preventing smallpox that country people in Turkey had used with great success. The method was called inoculation.